Welcome, gentlemen. I've been looking forward to this for some time. The topic of personalization has many dimensions to it and has been on my mind ever since I was in the government as director of privatization, you might call it personalization and funding reform, and found it a very controversial topic. But now we're 30 years later and it's taking on a life of its own again. So Ron, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Michael, and then I'll kick it off with a question to both of you. So Ron, tell us a little about yourself and why this topic's of interest.
Okay, I'm Ron Murch. I'm a former faculty member with the Haskayne School of Business in their information systems field. I was there for about 30 years and had a career in consulting and computer systems analysis, design development for a number of years. And I've been working with these various technologies for, I guess, since early 1966, which is quite a long time. That explains my haircut and the color of my facial hair. My interest of late has been through executive education, where I've been working with chief information officers, chief information security officers, practitioners, and so on, using these technologies in a corporate context, but they always have implications on individuals. And so the whole idea of personalization, I've come into it sort of through the back door. And quite frankly, I have a personal prejudice against social media. Most social media providers, because of the incredible manipulative power that they hold. And we'll probably get into a bit of discussion on that as we get
certainly a bit, that's for sure. And Michael, what about yourself?
I have opinions like Ron does, but I'm not sure they're the same always. I'm a lawyer with a large firm in Canada, based in Calgary. We're practicing in the IT and intellectual property space for over 40 years. So before personal computers and when timeshare was a big deal at the beginning of my career. In the last, say, 15, 20 years, I've been deeply involved in privacy law and more recently in cybersecurity law, but also in the regulation of personal information in one way or another, the protection of it. Have had a depth of experience, it seems like forever, in healthcare, health informatics, both from the IT licensing side, development side, and then in the privacy and ethics side. So it's been a very interesting ride. I've been paying attention to the deep currents in this space, because that's how you can kind of take a look 6 months or a couple of years out and see what the regulatory regime might look like, and be able to better advise clients on business structures and those kinds of things. So I don't pretend to have a crystal ball. Everything I've usually predicted has partially been correct and partially been obviously an error. So the crystal ball I do have is a lens from an old microfiche machine that's been shattered from being overheated. I keep that to remind myself. This is a fascinating topic, and it's hard not to have an opinion, personally and societally or morally. It's becoming a hot topic, hot potato as well.
Well, the definition of personalization, if you will, and that's really the topic for today, some say it's pretty clear. I mean, it's using information in order to customize products or services in order to better serve the individual. But there are two dimensions to this. One of them is how the client or the customer looks at it, and how the supplier responds. So we've got these two dimensions. There seems to be conflict in that gray area, which is the middle. I can recall personally going to the University of Calgary when I was director of privatization, let's call it personalization, back in the 1980s. And a prof stood up and he was incensed that anyone was entertaining privatization from the public sector, because from his perspective, it meant the supplier was in charge and the customer was going to have to take whatever they gave him. I was looking at it from a completely different perspective, and that is suppliers becoming much more sensitive to what individuals needed and moving away from programs to really looking at customizing and personalizing services so the individual could get what they want. Ron, you want to jump in here from your perspective as to how you've been looking at it and what you see as the controversy?
Well, I think there's a lot of various dimensions actually, and they're all confounded by the complex environment that all of us operate in. The complexities even of communication in the vignette that you just described, Perry, where you're having a conversation and the meaning on one side is not interpreted the same way by the recipient on the other side. When I mentioned earlier that I have this inherent prejudice, I guess you would say, against social media, that's a personal prejudice of mine. I do advise corporate organizations when they ask me, should we engage in social media or how should we engage? My advice always is absolutely, you have to pay attention to it because it's a viable communication channel, which is very important, but how you use that channel becomes important. The controversy is that my interpretation of the value that I get as an individual from the services that you're providing, so the value to me may be very different from the value to you. And if you are not recovering, there's a fundamental business principle actually, and Perry, from your consulting and accounting practices, you know this, that if your revenue is not, what you collect from or what you capture as revenue does not equal or exceed what it costs you to provide whatever that service is, you're not going to be in business very long. You're going to become a charity or you're going to go out of business, period. It's just the way it's going to work. And so your perception of the value of the service you're providing to me may be very different from my perception of the value of the service. And the common ground is important. But in the area of personalization, some aspects depend on data, which is much more important to me. And I want to be confident that you are treating it responsibly and you're safeguarding it and you're not sharing it necessarily and so on, because I want to be protective of that. Some data I don't care about.
This is, I mean, you've used the word data, which is, you know, the new oil. Everybody is well aware that there's a lot of data in the market today about individuals captured by the big tech, whether it be Facebook or Instagram or Google or whatever. They're monitoring our clicks. They know what we want. They think they know what we want, and they're prepared to show it to us before we even know and recognize we want it. So we're in a world which was once the world of the professions, which had an ethic that thou shalt do no harm because they had knowledge which the client, one step above a slave in Roman times, didn't have. Yeah. So the professions had an ethic. I'm not sure what the ethics are of those that are running social media today, but ethics takes us into the world of law. And Michael, I'm going to have you jump in here about what role law plays in making sure that we've got a balance here between, well, truth and otherwise.
I think the law's a little bit behind these questions. The regulatory regimes are behind the question, and we have an opportunity to guide discussions, but we have a habit of reacting to situations. So I would say that the legal regimes, in some senses, in direct regulation, are behind the times. We'll see now. I think Ron talked about the capture value. I think that there's a differential between what you might think of a profitable business having value, or a business with click-throughs or potential future revenues, or whatever the social media companies that don't really turn much of a profit and have gigantic valuations in the market. So that may be a reference to their ability to influence rather than their ability to distribute dividends or some other means. But I think that means that we can't rely on ordinary um, intuitive business models to think these things through right now. My own view is that personal information has been collected surreptitiously and in mass for a long time, and the data banks exist that we didn't know about, or that we don't think about, or we didn't think we were submitting ourselves to for the last 40 or 50 years. And I was thinking about who said it, Ron, privacy, get over it. Was that Bill Joy or one of those guys?
Was somebody from Sun, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Anyway, when I think about privacy, get over it, that is a bit of a common refrain amongst the social media crowd, or amongst the digitarati, or the digital natives, or whatever you call people like that. And only now are they thinking through how this is going to affect other things. So the ability of social media to segregate and herd populations into two crowds, into two herds, the ability to, or the function that just seems to grow up of having a search bubble arise around your preferences, and then that guides your future inquiries and answers, that it may guide your self-reinforce a set of preferences that aren't natural, something like that. So it strikes me that the implications of large data sets, the ability to search and collate them, machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, whatever you want to call it, and then the purported use to personalize, are things that we don't understand as well as we need to. I think we need to sharpen up and think about a little deeper about consequences.
If there's a lesson in history, and either one of you might want to jump in here, that, you know, healthcare, education, government in general, the concept of an ethic was because the public wasn't sure who to trust. And so the government stepped in and said, we'll give exclusive rights of practice to lawyers and engineers and teachers, wherever the public may be at risk, and we'll regulate them. And they said, you know, the ethic will be, thou shalt do no harm, but we will regulate you as a government, and we'll take away the exclusive rights of practice of your profession if you don't adhere to what is fair to the individual. So it's conceivable that government may step in here using the code of ethics and say, social media, we don't trust you, and we're not sure the public does either. Therefore, if you want to practice social media, you're going to have to accept the fact that government is going to regulate you and take away that right if in fact you don't abide by what's in the public's interest. Is that where we're headed?
I think we're probably stepping into that in the last couple of years, with SEC and FDA and those kinds of regulators taking positions about you've collected data under false pretenses, saying that you'd secure them or secure the data, or you've collected data without obtaining proper consent, and now you're using them for something else. And the concept of overstepping promises in the FTC kind of arena, or SEC kind of a trade practices kind of arena, is stepping up now. That may not take the place of ethics, but it imposes a type of ethic that the law has recognized for a long time, is that you can't mislead other people, and if you cause them harm, the fact that you misled them may make you responsible for the harm. We're sorting out what the harms are. I don't know exactly what the harms are, whether they're societal or to the individual, or who has the cause of action, who can make a claim, kind of thing. So I think that we're seeing that groundswell, but I'm worried about groundswells too, because now we may see them politicized and overused over the attack on social media and big data. Like Apple, the FANG group of companies is under increasing scrutiny by anti-monopolist regulators across the world. Like we're seeing the tools adjacent to ethics being used in an attempt to regulate ethics or regulate expectations about the collection and use of personal information. Now, I don't know, like been talking about the collection of information, but the personalization requires some other things. It requires some analysis and grouping and the utilization of this surveillance information for a purpose. And as you said, it's the subject's purpose, the provider's purpose, or it's the acquirer's purpose. So I get some personalized stuff. Is it junk mail or is it personalized genetically engineered medication? There's a difference.
Right.
And I might be willing to consent to the collection of an enormous amount of personal information for one, but not really interested in allowing anybody to collect that information for junk mail. So
I'm going to jump in here. I mean, there are two aspects what you've just raised. One of them is this issue is global, and the response of government are obviously differing between how China is approaching it, how Europe's approaching it, how the US is approaching it, as an illustration of whether or not an autocratic regime will simply impose upon social media and close down the internet. And I've got some news in the last couple of days of how many countries have actually closed down the internet as a byproduct of what they believe is not in the public interest, whether it be January 6th in the Capitol or what's going on in Myanmar or Beijing. So governments are scrambling with what authority they can, should, or would be allowed by the public to use. And that's one issue. The second one you've touched on really is intriguing, because this doesn't have to be negative. Personalization as a term in healthcare riled the professionals somewhat, because it implied that the person is going to be now in charge of their healthcare. Well, on the positive, they've certainly got more knowledge than they ever did before about healthcare, which is creating some tension between the concept of the client as a consumer and the supplier, because suppliers today are telling me that clients are changing. They have knowledge they never had before, and they want a relationship, and they want to have a dialogue. So we're seeing that interface between the professional as a supplier and the client as a consumer, which is privatization or market forces playing an increasing role in the distribution of knowledge. This changes the nature of commerce and the professions. Ron, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I do. You've used a term which is near and dear to my heart, and that is knowledge. And I might take a little bit of issue with you that the general population does not necessarily have more knowledge. They have better access to either data or information, however you want to say it. Everybody refers to it popularly as Dr. Google, but it's also it can be misinformation. And what has been quite challenging is that some of our social processes, like the education system, are wrestling with, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes not, with how to prepare individuals to properly assess the data and information that they have access to, critical thinking skills, if you will, so that they can make informed opinions. And in some ways, to come back to Michael's point about the ethics side that you were talking about before, it's unclear as to how much trust we can put in the provider. Why should I believe them? Like, how do I think through the complexity of that problem? And we're in a hugely complex and interconnected environment. So in some cases, say in personalized medicine, where I don't mind giving quite personal information to my doctor or my surgeon, my oncologist. I mean, it doesn't really matter. That relationship is usually reasonably established and you have the trust in that place. But if that information then is being used for something else, like my lab tests are now being made available to a pharmaceutical company so that they can engage in their pharmaceutical research work, and I am not informed of that, or I'm not properly informed of that, I might take exception to that. On the other hand, if it's going to benefit me because of a condition I have, and they're going to do their research and provide me with a personalized drug, I might feel really good about that. But how do I work through that mentally?
I mean, there's two dimensions to this as well. You started out with the point that should we trust that the individual has knowledge when in fact that may be misinformation. And yet in an environment where the market rules, whether the individual has misinformation or not, he's at risk. It's his problem. So we're wrestling with that as we've politicized this discussion, because this discussion hasn't been resolved. It's being left in the hands of government. And as you're seeing, and there's no better example than what's south of here, what will show up in the next election here in Canada, this is becoming a political issue, as those saying it's a civil right to live with misinformation. Unless you have a pandemic going on and someone says, but the public's at risk with you having misinformation, we're going to give you a passport or we're going to ensure that you get vaxxed. This topic leads quickly into the politicization of a discussion which would not have taken place before the internet. Information flowed much slower. Information and knowledge was presumably in the hands of the professions or the educators, but now every individual has access to the media and can become a publisher. I mean, this discussion right now, which will be witnessed by many, would not have been able to take place some years ago. What's going on with social media and Facebook? Opinions are being expressed all the time. How are you going to shut that down? How are you going to make sure that misinformation isn't guiding elections?
I'm not sure you can be sure. I think we have to trust in some of the basic democratic principles, like a free press and an educated population or an aware population.
But Mike, I'm going to jump right in there. Trust the free press. It's saying trust the media. People don't trust the media anymore.
I understand that, and that may be what's placing the continual democratic processes in some jeopardy.
Yes.
They used to have journalistic standards, you know.
Well, no, but not always. Right? I can think of some other.
Well, I don't know. Have any of you read Surveillance Capitalism, which says
Shoshana Zuboff,
fabulous book. I mean, I read through it, and I mean, in some ways, it validated my concerns that money will always dictate how knowledge actually flows and for what purpose it's being used, and commerce shows up high on the list, but so does healthcare. And as you've noted, there's good news in healthcare, is what we're learning with stem cells, what we're learning with genetic engineering. There's so many new technologies that made it possible now for the practitioner to say, I can customize the service for you. I don't need to know what your general category is. I know your DNA, I know your genetics, I know your family history, I know your lifestyle. Here's the right answer for you. Wow. I mean, that should be great news for all of us. But
can you repurpose that personal information and then aggregate it and use it for population management or healthcare system management or epidemiology?
But you're seeing individuals say, I don't want to be categorized anymore. I now know that you can customize a service for me. I want reassurance that this relationship is trustworthy and that you, in fact, are doing the right thing for me. And if I don't think you are, I'm going to shop around and go somewhere else.
With the guidance of social media and recommenders and referrers and rating systems. And
when I was director of privatization and funding reform with the Alberta government, I'd been iced. I had formerly been an ADM, but as a change agent, you wear your welcome out pretty quickly. But in any case, I had this topic and I took my role pretty seriously. And I'm not sure they wanted me to, but I began to interpret privatization not as a political ideology, but simply as an option for people to make choices, particularly the individual. And here we are. Individuals have information they never had before about themselves. And they are challenging the professions to say, look, I want to be assured that you are, in fact, doing the right thing for me. That's personalization in the extreme.
I should point out that the professions are changing quite dramatically.
Yes, too. They are.
If you looked at the ordinary physician community 20 years ago, it was essentially small business operators.
Right.
And if you look at the healthcare community or provider of healthcare community today, the providers are now practicing in larger aggregations in regional systems.
And smaller specialties too.
Well, it may be smaller specialties, but in more collaboration.
Yes.
The channels for the population have actually been narrowed so that the family doctor has a very limited function, almost as gatekeeper and filter, rather than as the guy who knows everything about me.
But that gatekeeper reinforces a point that I recognized a few years ago. McMaster University introduced to the health system a different form of recruiting for schools of medicine. And that was, it just wasn't the most knowledgeable students that you wanted. You wanted students who had relational skills as well. And that was being screened, implying that the client was changing. And the client was going to assume knowledge, but they wanted to know that it was a trustworthy relationship that they were engaged in.
These changes the shifts were enabled and pushed and advocate or
Promoted.
Rewarded, motivated
Yeah.
by changes in the data structures and the changes in the availability of data or the data that was collected,
right.
The channels available. If I look at my relationship with my physician community today, a lot of it is over Zoom calls like this, and that would have been unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, they didn't like to deal with faxes or even telephone consultations. So the information channels and the information systems that back up certain professions or certain functions in society actually cause and funnel the shift of behaviors or the shift in systems.
Ron, we've got only a few more minutes. Ron, I'm going to give you, it won't be the last word because I don't think this is ever going to end. And we've got a webinar coming up on precision medicine, and that medicine is ducking the term personalized healthcare and wanting to make the statement that they have enough information that they can be much more precise in their practices. But in any case, Ron, you want to wrap this up?
I'll just make two quick points, I think. One of them is that the relationships that we have just been exploring require a different level of education on both sides of the relationships, and a different level of ethical appreciation and understanding on both sides in order for the relationship to be successful. And so if you are a provider and you're prepared to offer me personalized service, but I am not sufficiently well informed or mentally prepared to engage responsibly in that process, then that's not going to be successful. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that one person's reliable information could very easily be another person's misinformation. And there are long-term consequences because of the complexity of the environment. And this will be particularly true in medicine, but it will be in other dynamics as well, where we just don't have enough history to fully understand the complexity. And if you think of stem cell implants and that sort of thing, there may, in fact, at some point in the future, be evolutionary dynamics which are affected by a treatment enacted today, which doesn't show up for several generations. And we won't know that. It's it's almost impossible to anticipate or to predict that. So one has to be at least informed sufficiently and have the ability to make cognitive choices about how to engage in a personalized transaction situation. And also, I think you also have to have the opportunity to say, no, I don't wish to be involved in that kind of situation. Thank you.
Well, it's clearly a challenge for the education system to prepare students to be civil in our changing society. Lawyers and the legal systems are clearly being challenged to keep up. I'm not sure what the mechanism is going to be. I'm glad to hear that there's a dialogue going on, because it will be challenging democratic and/or socialistic processes to say, is this a left-right debate? is this more or less government? Are we really even looking at a new regime of governance that we haven't even conceived of yet? Is that going to be where we end up? I don't know, but I'm excited by the dialogue. I think I think it will transform what's going on in the professions, and I think this century is going to be a very interesting century. And unfortunately, we're not going to live through it all. But I thank you, Michael.
Speak for yourself.
I thank you, Ron. Well, if
Thanks for having us.
stem cells do what stem cells have the promise to do, maybe we will be here reflecting on this discussion 50 years from now.
Well,
Look at our retirement planning then.
Yeah.
thanks, Perry.
Well, I thank you, and in that you look like you're each ready for the geriatric G-force. Enjoy the golf, gardening, and grandchildren. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.